Mr. Pell slowly opened the old shoebox on the farmhouse table. Everyone watched in silence, unaware that its contents would change their family's future. Ruth laughed dismissively, as though the entire meeting were pointless. For years, she had believed Caleb was the least important person in the family. Everyone sat around the old wooden table, waiting for someone to speak. The shoebox remained in the center, surrounded by nervous faces and unanswered questions. Caleb sat quietly among his relatives. He had heard their judgment for years, but today he wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to listen. Long before this meeting, Caleb had been only a little boy. Life had taken him away from his family and placed him in Amos's care. Ruth remembered those years differently. She believed Caleb's simple life on the farm meant he had never achieved anything worth respecting. When Caleb first arrived, he carried almost everything he owned in one small suitcase. He had no idea how completely the farm would change his life. As the vehicle left the town behind, young Caleb stared through the window. Houses disappeared, and endless fields slowly became his new world. At the end of that long gravel road stood Amos's farmhouse. It was old, modest, and surrounded by the land Amos had spent his life protecting. Amos waited beside the driveway with his farm dog. His clothes were worn, his hands were weathered, but his quiet expression immediately made Caleb feel welcome. Amos's face carried decades of sun and hard work. Yet behind those deep lines were kind eyes that seemed to understand Caleb without asking questions. Ruth handed Caleb's suitcase to Amos and prepared to leave. Caleb stood quietly beside them, still unsure what his new life would become. Amos placed a simple feed bucket into Caleb's hands. It was a small responsibility, but it was Amos's first lesson: everyone has work worth doing. Soon, Caleb was feeding the chickens each morning. He learned that farm life demanded patience, consistency, and the willingness to work even when nobody was watching. At sunset, Amos and Caleb sat together outside the farmhouse. They had little money, but Caleb was beginning to understand that having someone who believed in you mattered more. One evening, a powerful storm moved across the fields. Caleb watched Amos remain calm as the wind strengthened, learning that fear did not have to control a person. Years later, Caleb helped Amos care for a newborn calf. That night, the boy learned another lesson: good things often required patience before they could grow. In the workshop, Amos taught Caleb how to work carefully with his hands. He explained that doing something properly mattered more than doing it quickly. At sunset, Amos and Caleb sat together on the old pickup. Amos looked across the fields and quietly reminded him that honest work always leaves something behind. Even when Caleb made mistakes, Amos rarely shouted. Sometimes a raised eyebrow was enough. Caleb had learned to understand the old farmer without many words. At night, the small seed shed glowed alone beside the fields. Caleb often wondered why Amos spent so much time inside that little building. Inside, Amos carefully wrote in an old notebook. Caleb didn't know what those pages contained, only that Amos treated every entry as something important. One evening, Caleb watched from nearby as Amos continued writing. The old farmer noticed him, but he didn't explain the notebook's purpose. Then relatives began arriving at the farm. Their presence changed the peaceful atmosphere, and Caleb could sense that something important was about to happen. During a family gathering, everyone sat around the table together. Caleb noticed that the adults spoke freely, while he was expected to remain quiet. As Caleb grew older, the comments became harder to ignore. His family looked down on his farm work, believing it proved he would never succeed. The work boots beneath the small tree were not expensive. But to Caleb, they represented something important: the dignity of earning his place through hard work. The difference between Caleb and the others was becoming obvious. Some measured success by possessions, while Caleb measured it by what his hands could accomplish. Ruth's criticism became sharper. She looked at Caleb's simple life as evidence of failure, never realizing how much Amos had already taught him. Caleb kept his hand against the table and said nothing. He had learned from Amos that not every insult deserved an answer. Then Amos placed his glass on the table. The room immediately became quiet, because everyone knew the old farmer was finally ready to speak. Nobody interrupted Amos. Ruth looked down, Gerald shifted in his chair, and Caleb watched the man who had quietly protected him for most of his life. Years later, Caleb drove along the country highway, carrying the lessons Amos had given him. He had left the farm for a time, but he had never forgotten it. Caleb stood outside an agricultural school holding his folder. He had continued learning, proving to himself that being underestimated did not mean being incapable. Back at the farm, Amos grew older and weaker. He sat on the porch, watching the fields he had spent decades planting, harvesting, and protecting. Caleb returned to the farm as a young man and worked beside the old tractor until sunset. He no longer worked for praise. He worked because the farm mattered. As Amos became weaker, Caleb stayed close. Night after night, he sat beside the old farmer's bed, quietly returning the loyalty Amos had once given him. Then one morning, the farmhouse telephone rang. Caleb reached for the receiver, and the silence that followed told him something had gone terribly wrong. Amos lay quietly in his bed while pale morning light entered the room. Caleb stood nearby, realizing that the man who raised him was nearing the end. After Amos was gone, Caleb walked into the open fields. Geese crossed the sky above him, while the farm remained strangely quiet. Caleb remembered Amos's hand resting over his own. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything the old farmer had never needed to say aloud. At dawn, Caleb stood alone on the farmhouse porch. For the first time, the responsibility of protecting Amos's legacy rested entirely on his shoulders. The northern fence had fallen apart. Caleb walked through the tall grass, seeing how much work the farm now needed. At Amos's memorial, Caleb stood quietly beside the stone. He lowered his head, remembering the farmer who had given him something more valuable than money. Then Mr. Pell arrived at the farmhouse carrying his leather folio. Caleb immediately understood that Amos had left something behind that still needed to be revealed. The family gathered around the table once again. This time, however, everyone was watching the documents instead of judging Caleb. Mr. Pell adjusted his glasses and began explaining the papers. Caleb listened quietly while the others waited to learn what Amos had planned. The family finally saw the true scale of Amos's land. Miles of field surrounded the farmhouse, far more valuable than anyone had understood. Mr. Pell pointed to the old land map. Boundaries and property records revealed that Amos had carefully protected the farm for many years. Gerald leaned forward as the truth began to sink in. The man he had underestimated had planned everything far more carefully than Gerald imagined. An old financial record revealed years of careful payments and agreements. Amos had been preparing for the future without telling anyone what he was doing. Caleb's old truck and worn work boots represented the life Amos had taught him to respect. He had never needed expensive possessions to prove his value. Grandmother finally understood what Amos had been doing. Her expression changed as she realized how completely the family had misunderstood Caleb. Gerald remembered his own failed contracting business. For the first time, he understood that Amos had quietly helped him when Gerald believed nobody had noticed. Years earlier, Amos had signed important papers without seeking praise. He had always preferred helping people quietly rather than telling the world what he had done. Even strangers had received Amos's help. He had paid a hospital bill for someone in need and never asked for recognition. Gerald's face went pale as the truth became impossible to ignore. Amos had been helping others while Gerald had been calling Caleb useless. Ruth finally understood too. Her confidence disappeared as she realized that Amos had never measured Caleb by money, status, or appearances. Then Mr. Pell opened the old shoebox again. Inside were 22 notebooks, each one carefully preserved by Amos for a reason. Caleb opened one notebook and saw Amos's familiar handwriting. Page after page contained years of records, decisions, sacrifices, and quiet acts of kindness. Caleb read the notebook with trembling hands. For the first time, he could see how carefully Amos had been preparing him for the future. Then Caleb discovered a folded letter hidden inside the final notebook. His hands became still as he realized it had been written especially for him. Caleb closed the shoebox slowly. He no longer needed to prove his worth to the people sitting around that table. Instead, Caleb signed the final papers and returned them to Mr. Pell. He made his decision calmly, without anger or bitterness. The next morning, Caleb returned to the fields and began rebuilding Amos's fence. His greatest inheritance was not the land. It was the lesson Amos had left him: a person's worth is proven by what they do when nobody is watching.